Welcome to Thrive, your agency resource, the only podcast for creative, media, and technology leaders who are ready to dive deeper into conscious leadership and agency growth. I'm your host, Kelly Campbell. Thrive is brought to you by Accessity, the leading web accessibility solutions provider. Join thousands of agencies that are already incorporating web inclusivity into their service offerings. Visit accessity.com today. Welcome back to Thrive. What a great discussion I had with Josh Basil on the first episode. I hope that you were able to catch that. We're going to keep that momentum going this year. And today I have an incredibly special guest. Gina Hayden is the co-founder of the Global Center for Conscious Leadership and a director for Conscious Capitalism UK. In 2016, Gina actually published a book called Becoming a Conscious Leader, How to Lead Successfully in a World That's Waking Up. And I have to say that book, and she knows this, that book has literally become my Bible. I connected with Gina a few months ago, and I'm not only excited to share that she is actually going to be writing the foreword for my book upcoming, I'm also thrilled to have her on the show today. So we're going to uncover some of the gaps in effective leadership, and I really hope you enjoy the conversation. So Gina, a warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I always love our time together.
I'm really looking forward to talking with you. Thank you. Really excited.
Yeah. So I think a great place to start, just so everybody's on the same page, would be, how do you define effective leadership, right? Because I think a lot of people have different definitions of that.
Mm-hmm. So it's probably worth saying I do a lot of work with corporations, a lot of work with leaders at different levels in corporations, right up to chief execs, and with their teams and developing leadership programs. So I'm quite immersed in this space. And I think that at one level, effective leadership is definitely, to my mind, combining, achieving results through people. So that then combines the task and the human. And I know that there are companies out there where it's purely about the task. I've got some clients where it's purely about the task, never mind the fact that there are humans executing it. And other companies that I'm working with where it's very much about the people, but sometimes they get a bit sketchy on pushing on the task. So I think a really good way is thinking about achieving results through people, and how do you as a leader contain both of those things and balance that particular seesaw. But beyond that, I think the notion, for me anyway, with conscious leadership, the really effective leadership is this notion of moving from me to we to the world. Mm-hmm. How do I have self-mastery of myself so that, and we'll come on to that, what does that actually mean? But I'm operating at the highest level in integrity to myself and being a good beacon for others as a leader. How does that translate into my relationship so that the we is at the optimal level, whether it's team and organization? And then the world part is actually the really exciting bit now and in the future is, what is the potential impact that my company can make in the world out there that is actually for the greater good, that's for the benefit of more than just me personally or us in the organization and our shareholders? How do we take that out and include business and organizations in an outcome that looks positive for as many people as possible and the planet, etc.
Right.
So for me, that's effective leadership.
Yeah. And I couldn't have encapsulated that any better. And I think it's important to understand, or to mention, that when we say the world, we are talking about, starting sort of close to home, right? So local community, and then the ripple effect that just naturally occurs with how other people are impacted by that ripple effect, right? So it could be someone in the community who is being helped through some give back, that is happening because of the organization or the company. Then it could be, the ripple effect of that on someone else, and it just goes out, further and further. So I think it's important, because some people will focus in on that and say, well, how could my company impact the world? That seems really grandiose, right? So I wanted to just kind of dial that in.
Oh, that's really good. I mean, I got a couple of quick examples for you, which I think really help to illustrate.
Great.
So one guy that I interviewed for the book. So I'm South African, as you can probably hear from my accent, even though I've been living in London for like 25 years, still stays. And I grew up in South Africa at the time of apartheid. And one of the guys I interviewed also grew up, and we were at the same age. So we were living on very, very different sides of the fence in the country at the time. He went on to become a very senior chief executive of this multinational. And he described it to me as, I would say he's a conscious leader. He described it to me as bringing in coaches to work with the people in his company who were coaching not only for success, but also significance, which I really love, right? Success and significance. Yeah. He said that what happens then is if individuals in the company are in touch with what is the significance of what it is they're trying to do, they take that into their families, they take into the communities, and that has a different impact just by nature of a positive knock-on effect, ripple effect. And he said that his, for him, that was a way of bringing his experience from that era in South Africa and actually making a societal change through community, which he felt was really important. So at a more micro level, I think it's like we go back to our families, and do we choose to sort of kick the cat, or do we choose to have mastery for ourselves? How are we showing up in our families? How are we showing up for our kids? Are their eyes shining or are they dull? And then what is the impact of that when they go out into? So I think it's at micro level and macro level. There's loads we can do.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, that it's not just outside of, right? It actually can be internal in terms of your own family unit. So yeah, that's a great point. I think it's also, I know we're going to talk about conscious leadership a lot. So I think it's important to kind of understand from the audience's perspective, like, what do we mean in terms of the differences between a conscious leader and an unconscious, or what I might call a wounded leader, in terms of the characteristics. And I know you have sort of like a model of 4 different components that you kind of pull from. So would love to just kind of level set on that as well.
Okay. I think the first thing that's really important to say is we're all human beings having an experience in life. From one perspective, we might say of waking up more and more and more to ourselves, right?
Sure.
So I like to think of it as a continuum. And there are some who are, and we'll look at, what does more asleep mean? But there are some are sort of at the more asleep end of the continuum, and some are at the very awake end of the continuum. Right. And for me, the more asleep end of the continuum, or more unconscious leadership, just more asleep, would be people who haven't really gotten on top of their own programming. So the sort of assumptions that, what I mean by programming is the assumptions that they've learned about how the world works, the beliefs that they hold, the way that they try to create security for themselves. So it could be one way of looking at it, fear and love, right? So there's sort of like, the world is a threat, I need to survive. Therefore, my behavior at the more asleep end is, and we see this in business all the time, is really about self-preservation. And also knowing yourself and mastering yourself. And up towards the more, as we move along, we get to know ourselves and a bit better. So rather than uploading that sort of same behavior that I do to ensure my preservation and survival every time, sometimes without thinking, there's a bit of a gap that gets created between seeing that thing like, oh, there I go again, and the gap of choice. So there's awareness and choice, or no awareness and no choice. And so the choice that comes in then enables us to do things differently. So as we move towards the more kind of awakened leader or conscious leadership side of things, you start seeing people acting out of choice, acting out of compassion and love and kindness and those good qualities, less from defense and self-preservation and survival. And then also acting in a way that's more about we rather than about me. And at the upper end, for the world rather than just the me and the we.
Right.
Yeah.
I love this definition so much. I love the idea of a continuum, because we can be on any part of that continuum, right, throughout our lives. Although typically you would move from the sort of asleep to awake, right? But that doesn't mean that sometimes you can't backtrack because things set you back, or there are circumstances outside of your control that, it makes it difficult. But the point is that you're moving fluidly throughout your life, and ultimately, moving from this asleep or unconscious way of being in the world where you're very reactive, you're not really self-aware, there's not a lot of emotional intelligence present, to this place where all of those things are basically becoming like a practice, or almost, I wouldn't say a default, because this does take work, right? Constant work.
It sure does.
To undo the programming that you mentioned. It's funny, you said awakened, as in like kind of past tense. And I was talking with my Buddhist psychology coach, and she was like, could you change that for me to awakening?
Awakening, yes.
She said, awakened is really what we're talking about, like you've achieved like enlightenment or Buddhahood. She's like, the amount of people who have achieved that is probably very, very little. So can we call it awakening? I said, fine, I will.
No, I concur with that. I concur.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about the kind of the woundedness in all of us as well. I mean, I think there is something very compassionate about this continuum, because we're all doing the best we can with what we've got. So it's kind of more fun to do it together. We feel better when we're coming at it from a sense of we, rather than kind of I have to fight people for my corner, which is like, you don't really want to live in that space. It's de-energizing. Right. But I think the woundedness, in your book, just reading that first chapter in your intro, we all have the experiences that have happened to us that have created these wounds. And really, when we're just acting, and I'm including myself in this, by the way, when we act out of, when that program gets loaded up, which is about survival, and we're just acting out of that wound, we don't really have a lot of choice in the matter. So I think, you made the point, it's a life's work, and we have to do the work to get to grips with what it is that's formed and shaped us. Then we begin to have some choice over it.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to go back to this idea about programming and wounding and why we're using those terms. I actually just realized as I'm writing this book that the word trauma actually is derived from the Greek, literally meaning wound. And that was fascinating to me, because we think of trauma as like, big T or small t trauma, right? Things that were acute or chronic, prolonged, or complex, multi-layered and long-lasting, right? But what's interesting to me is that Dr. Gabor Mate, which we all know and love, talks about trauma from the standpoint of not being the thing that happened to you or happened to you on an ongoing basis. It's actually what happens inside of you or within you as a result of what happened to you, right? So when we talk about trauma or wounding, that's where the correlation comes in with an unconscious leader, right? If you're still on you said online or maybe offline, we could call it. If you're offline and still running those same patterns and behaviors, maladaptive behaviors, where you are reacting and you're not self-aware and all these things, like that's the correlation. So I just wanted to tie those two dots together, because I think that might be helpful.
Nicely said.
Did you know that 1 out of 5 people in the US is living with some form of disability? I'm proud to partner with Accessity as they work toward the mission of making the web accessible to everyone. It's time to prioritize inclusivity. Ensure that your own website and your client sites can be accessed by all, and that they're ADA compliant. Head over to accessity.com/thrive to learn more about their agency partner program. Now, back to the show. So most of the people who are listening or watching are going to say, yeah, Gina, this sounds great. And I love to play devil's advocate on the show. So if I wanted to begin on this journey, because I think I'm somewhere, like I'm not necessarily totally asleep, but I know that I'm definitely not awakening on that end of the continuum, how would one begin to identify where they sit on that continuum?
So there are 2 things I think to speak to here. The easy answer, I'll give it easy. Well, easy, I don't know, is it easy? But anyway, the quicker answer There is a thing that you can search up online called the consciousness quotient. And this is being developed by a professor in Hungary, I think it is, for a number of years now. I think probably for 10 years he's been working on it. And he's emailed me recently to say this kind of vamped up version of it is kind of out there now. If you wanted to get a sort of, how am I doing in the space of being awake? I think that's a good instrument to play around with, and he's interested in more research for it as well.
I would
So
definitely put that in the show notes for sure.
Definitely, yeah. That's a good thing, and he deserves to be supported. He's very interested in this. I think there are many ways then that you can also look at your own practice in your own life. So you and I were talking before you started recording, Kelly, around this sort of framework that I work with. So there's the kind of the self-mastery part of it, so what are the qualities of self-mastery? That's one way of coming in, one doorway. There's how am I doing in my relationships with others? Mm-hmm. And then there's kind of the world and the world beyond. So I think an easy route in is the self-mastery piece. Normally what I recommend is for people to, first of all, actually go and have a look at their values and do a values instrument, whether you go to Barrett Values Center and do a personal values assessment, or the exercise I often do with clients is I just have a list of values and I get them to choose 10 and then to whittle it down to 5 and then whittle it down to 3.
I've done that exercise before. It's a great exercise.
It's a really cool exercise, not because you've got to be defined by anything and boxed in, but it forces you to think about what's important. Prioritization. And then what do you do with it? So then the question's like, how am I living this every day in my life? Right. How do my values connect with my organization's values? Yeah. Another great question in the interest of self-authoring, because we're not born with our values. Where do they come from? They're created over time, and we get to change them because we're fluid. So maybe a question to ask is, what value would I like to bring into my life more in 2022 or in my work right now? Yeah. So it's beginning to look at, and what would that mean in real life, actually practically. The other angle to come in is through purpose. So you can do some purpose exercises. And again, people get a bit scared of the notion of purpose because they're sort of, purpose. And then it's sort of etched in blood for rest of, no, it's a sense. Richard Leader does a wonderful book, Lied, maybe show notes as well, Richard Leader, called, I think it's The Power of Purpose. I've got it up here. And he says purpose is 3 things. It is a sense of direction. It's a practice. And so every day, how you're living it. And it's also an evolutionary and developmental path.
Oh, I love that.
That's it's great. Kind of, it's fluid rather than this heavy responsibility. We have to find our purpose. I mean, who wants that in life? We're not that static as beings. So I think exploring either Ikigai, IKIGI, the Ikigai framework is great, or which you can find online, or something like Richard Leader's work, just beginning to play around with what is it that gives me energy? What do I want to contribute to the world? What can I get paid for? What does the world need? And looking for opportunities of what is the bigger potentiality in the work that I do? Because we feel good when we're making a contribution. So if I'm living my values and I'm as much as I can, and I'm living on purpose, I'm having a more rewarding life. And that's a really good beginning step. Yeah, I think from beginning to think about living more consciously.
Yeah, I think that's great. Those are all really, really helpful. And obviously we'll put notes to all of those in the show notes. Yeah, okay. So I'm just kind of like wrapping my head around all of the different ways in which you can approach this. I really liked the last one that you talked about though, because I feel like that sort of triumvirate of, sort of North Star, plus
practice and like a evolutionary journey thing.
And and the fact that it evolves over time. I mean, that feels I'm a person who doesn't like to be boxed into frameworks. I like scaffolding because there's lots of breathing room. So that feels really good. That feels like a lot of breathing room to me. And I think that's a great place to start. when you're working with clients who are kind of at this beginning stage, I'm assuming that they're reaching out to you because they resonate with your work, they resonate with conscious leadership. Maybe they even have that natural propensity toward conscious leadership, as I said before. But where, in addition to these kind of frameworks that you just mentioned, where do you start to help them move? Because you're not doing the work for them, they're doing the work, right, as a coach. But how do you start to help them move forward to actually like define what this actually looks like in practice for them, and yeah, help them actually bring it into their business, which is, I think, is the crux of what we're talking about here.
Beautiful question. So I'm finding in my work that people are either, well, when they turn up, sometimes things have happened to people, and some of your listeners and watchers might actually have this happen to them. There seem to be a couple of starter conditions and initiating conditions.
Sure.
One of them is that you've been achieving like crazy all your life, and you kind of go, well, is that all there is? Like, there's just another thing. Like, didn't I get that thing already? Right. So it's like this sort of
the introduction to my book.
The achievement just is like, you know, so that's one thing. Sometimes there's a real sense of uncertainty, and the pandemic has, I think, this and previously the recession, no matter your best attempts, rugs being pulled up from underneath you. Right. And everything you thought was certain is now uncertain. So there's a kind of a crumbling of what we mistook as stability and substantiality in life. And life kind of goes whack. And we're forced, it will, no matter it will, and absolutely, we're forced to kind of wake up, right, to out of a dream. Sometimes people will arrive and they will either have had a lot of experiences and want to apply those experiences, like the guy I told you about in South Africa, or sometimes they're just born with this kind of inner knowing, and the inner knowing is like just they're looking for a space to explore something that feels unsaid in them. So they'll arrive at my door and we'll work with that. And often then the questions are around, sometimes we'll do some of the exercises I explained, but we'll also look at helping them to become present to themselves, to listen to what their intuition is saying, not just what their head is saying. And often in the way of working, and it happens in our conversations, that I'm not actually thinking anything. I'm not making the conversation happen. I'm just being present to them and listening. And in between us, some answers are emerging, or some questions are emerging, which then turn into, how do you apply this in your business and your leadership? So I would say the starting point, I think, is the self. Yeah. The starting point seems to be, who are we being in the world? And then with the right kind of help, whether it's coaching or a friend or whatever, it's really just beginning to think about, well, how does this come out? How am I showing up with my teams? Yeah. I've had many conversations with let's call them conscious leaders of the B Corp movement, the benefit corporation movement, where they've been super awake, like they've been working in big corporates, for instance, where they've deeply disturbed, let's even say 3-4 years ago, before plastic was, so much on our radar, deeply disturbed by the amount of plastic that their companies were producing, and finding that they were one of a dozen people in their companies to be thinking this, whereas the people at the top were just thinking profits. Right. It's this deeply disturbing feeling of where is my tribe? So I think finding people like you in your companies, often younger people, I might say, because the generations coming up are awake, right? In many cases awake, and connecting through and seeing what you can influence, finding your tribe, that can be really, really good in an organization. What can you do together?
That's great. It's interesting. So I'm a new member of the Conscious Leadership Guild, which I think you're familiar with. Yeah. Everyone that I mentioned about you writing the forward, they were like, "Oh my God, that's great. We love Gina." But it was interesting because I was in a breakout session during, I think it was just 2 days ago. And this woman was talking about how back in the 1980s, she was leading workshops inside of DuPont as a consultant. She was leading workshops on how to tap into intuition in business. I was like, you were doing that in the 80s? I mean,
brave woman.
But unbelievable. So, the thing is, a lot of people will say, oh, this is brand new, this is new age, like not a lot of companies are doing this. Like huge corporations have been doing this for decades. And I feel like the smaller businesses, just, I don't know, for whatever reason, it's taken this long to get there. But listen, we're here now. It is not strange. And the inner knowing, the deeper knowing that you're talking about, I feel like if we do pause and dial in and actually listen to that, that's kind of where the start is for me. I always say, like, dialing up your curiosity, right? Like, what is actually calling you?
Yes, and
right
listening.
in your world, right? Or the values that you talked about, right?
Yeah.
I love the question of, all right, so what are my values now, but what is a value that I want to bring into my life that I don't necessarily have right now, right? Mine in like 2019 or 2020 was integrity. I wanted more integrity in my life. And so that became sort of a North Star. Now this year it's impact. That's my North Star, right? So you can, as you said, you can evolve.
Beautiful. You can evolve. You can choose. I mean, we have the power to choose. So there's something, and this might seem a bit radical for your listeners, but
go for it.
It's been really helpful to me. So the guy that I work with, who's I would consider, awakened, extremely evolved teacher, he helped me to understand that there is self-mastery and then there's transcendence. And I love this because the self-mastery is how we play in the world. And we're talking at the moment about self-mastery, how to play a happier, more fulfilled, more creative, more choiceful life. And like, who doesn't want that, right? And then there's transcendence, which is realizing that it's all made up anyway. And not we are not, in the Matrix. Yes, not confusing the movie with reality. And that's a whole different level of choice, right? That is like a wise, grounded place of grounded being to live in every day, and not be, and oh my goodness, I have not mastered this at all, but not be triggered by events that happen on the screen in front of you in quite the same way. So I think it does start with ourselves, and it starts with thinking, or maybe exploring into, yes, there's self-mastery and then there's transcendence, and what does that mean? And honestly, mindfulness, a great fan, right? Because I think meditation, mindfulness just grounds you in everything that's before our thoughts, and helps to separate us away from the tyranny. I'm going to talk in personal capacity, the tyranny of my thoughts at 3 a.m. in the morning. Could you just shut up, right? I hope I'm not alone. I'm sure I'm not alone in this.
You are not alone. This is a whole audience, owners and leaders. You are not alone.
Like, damn, like, just stop already, so just that quiet place, which is before thought, and being located more in here than in the kind of in the movie. That's a really important thing. I mean, the other thing I just want to add in is yes, it's us, but also it seems to me lately to be context. So when I wrote this book, which I honestly wrote for ages and had like 3 versions of it, and they were all like more rubbish than the previous one, and I realized what I needed to do was all theoretical. I had to come and interview people who were of this up at this end of the spectrum, and write about them and use real data, and then it started flowing. So it took a long time. But it came out at the end of 2016. And at the time, I'd been involved since like 2012, 13 with conscious capitalism and thinking about conscious leadership. At that time, you did not use the word conscious and business in the same sentence, right? I remember driving in London, coming down the city road from the Silicon Roundabout, and there was some fashion company had actually put like conscious apparel on this big billboard. I was like, what? That was like radical. And then plastics we weren't aware of, climate change wasn't so much on the radar. There was nothing to do with gender, and there was nothing to do with kind of race and diversity, really. These days, the context is forcing us to evolve.
That's right.
You can't even like throw a stick and not hit something that you're supposed to be more awake about.
Right.
So I think that climate is all over business at the moment. I think it's forcing us to evolve. Yeah. Thank goodness. So it's partly us, partly context, I believe. I think now my book seems out of date, by the way. I now read it. I'm
no, it's.
I felt really, in front of the cart at that point. Now I'm like, damn, that's a bit old now.
No,
aren't all books out of date.
It's still my Bible. I have it by my bedside, like one would. But no, I think that's a great place to wrap and a great point. And yeah, this conversation, I mean, obviously we could extend this for hours and hours.
We could go on for hours, you and I.
I love chatting. But I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will definitely talk soon. And I'm so excited about the work that we're doing together.
It's been great talking. Thanks again.
Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to subscribe wherever you watch or listen. And a final note of gratitude to the official sponsor of Thrive, Accessity, the leading web accessibility solutions provider. Learn more about the win-win proposition and keep your clients' websites inclusive and compliant. Be sure to check out their partner program for your agency today at accessity.com/thrive.